Riccardo Bellini, a millionaire businessman accustomed to luxury and the high society conventions, decided to bring Giulia, his longtime housemaid, to an important business dinner. He intended to reward her years of dedication, but he never imagined that Giulia would reveal a secret that would shake not only the businesspeople present, but also Riccardo himself and his view of the world around him. The restaurant's hall was illuminated by crystal chandeliers, with a soft hum of formal conversations filling the room. Riccardo Bellini sat at the head of the table, surrounded by top executives and renowned business figures, all powerful players in the corporate world. At the other end of the table, a figure starkly contrasted with the luxury and sophistication around her, Giulia, his maid, with a calm gaze and a simplicity that made her stand out even more among the other guests. When everyone's attention shifted to Giulia, a curious silence settled over the room. Nobody really understood why she was there at such an exclusive dinner. She was just a maid, after all, or so everyone thought. But when Giulia stood up and began to speak, what she revealed brought an unexpected wave of emotion, uncovering secrets buried for years. Through tears and incredulous looks, each word of hers seeped into the hearts of those around. The night took an unimaginable turn, and everyone present found themselves facing questions of loyalty, values, and the true essence of who they really were. Riccardo Bellini, with his pristine suit and firm gaze, was the embodiment of success. At 52, he had built an investment empire and, with it, an unshakable reputation as one of the country's most influential businessmen. His coldness in business made him ruthless, yet he occasionally allowed himself rare moments of generosity. That night, he had invited Giulia, his longtime maid, to dinner as a gesture of gratitude for her quiet loyalty. Giulia, now 47, had worked for Riccardo since she was 20, initially hired by his family to care for the house. Reserved and soft-spoken, she was mostly invisible to the powerful people who frequented the Bellini mansion. Her hair was beginning to show streaks of gray, and her face, marked by time, told a story of sacrifices, even though she had never shared her life with anyone. Upon entering the luxurious restaurant, Giulia felt out of place, but Riccardo ensured she was treated well. He knew the evening would involve business, but he also wanted his maid to witness a side of his life she had never seen. Among the high-ranking executives, Giulia stood out with her modest appearance and an expression of serenity that contrasted sharply with the calculated coolness of the guests. As the evening went on, Riccardo began introducing Giulia to some people, explaining that she had been part of the Bellini family for decades. But as he did so, he noticed some puzzled looks. After all, a maid wasn't exactly family to these people. Yet there was something about Giulia that exuded a mysterious strength, a sense that she had faced challenges far greater than those discussed at the table. As minutes passed, Giulia remained silent, observing the people around her. She understood the etiquette, but she knew this wasn't her reality. She simply watched as well-dressed men and women discussed business strategies and bragged about their fortunes, oblivious to anything outside their exclusive circles. Then, driven by a sudden impulse, Riccardo asked Giulia a question that would change the night's course. "Giulia," he said, with a slight hint of irony, "what do you make of all this?" He wanted to test the perspective of a simple person amid the elite conversations, perhaps to entertain the guests. But Giulia didn't smile or hesitate. She took a deep breath, looking at those present with a sincerity that threw everyone off balance. "I think, sometimes, everyone here forgets what really matters in life." The room fell into a profound silence. Riccardo was baffled, but before he could interrupt, Giulia continued, her voice firm and emotional, ready to share a story none of them would ever forget. The restaurant, once filled with light laughter and pretentious conversations, was now engulfed in a silence that throbbed with growing curiosity. The executives' gazes shifted between surprise and mild disdain as they watched Giulia, a regular woman, dare to express her opinion among the elite. But as they met the depth in her eyes, many sensed something more, a hidden pain she seemed finally ready to reveal. Giulia took a deep breath before she began, and her voice, steady and serene, sliced through the air like a sharp blade. "Mr. Bellini and I come from very different worlds," she began, and her serious expression made it clear that her words would not be light. I come from a small town where opportunities are rare, and dreams are luxuries only a few can afford. I started working for the Bellini family when I was very young, with the promise of a steady job and a chance to help my parents, who were ill. The guests listened attentively, some still with raised eyebrows, trying to grasp her purpose in sharing her personal story. Ricardo watched Julia, growing more intrigued and, for the first time, feeling a hint of concern. She was revealing a part of her life he had never deeply questioned, as if what happened outside his mansion was somehow irrelevant. "I never complain about anything," she continued, keeping a calm tone, "but the life of those who serve, ladies and gentlemen, is not a life of dreams. It's a life of silences, of hidden battles, and of secrets we keep just to survive." That statement visibly affected some of the guests. A middle-aged woman, married to one of Ricardo's partners, averted her gaze, uncomfortable. A younger executive adjusted his posture, trying to maintain a neutral expression. Julia pressed on, undeterred. "I accepted my role without question. I did everything I could to raise my son, Pedro, while working long hours. Mr. Bellini never knew half of my life. The sacrifices I made so that my son could have a chance, so that he could live a better life than mine." Julia's words carried unexpected strength, and even Ricardo appeared uncertain. He didn't know about her son, Pedro, as deeply as she was now revealing. In all these years, she had never mentioned the struggles she faced as a single mother. He remembered asking once or twice, but there was always a discreet silence in response. She didn't want to talk, and he, too busy, never pressed. Pedro grew up without knowing his father, Julia confessed, her voice trembling slightly, and the silence in the room deepened. "I tried to give him everything I could, but it wasn't enough." Ricardo felt a weight as he heard her words. Over the years, he'd seen her work without complaint, dedicating herself to the job with discipline. He had never imagined she might carry such pain, or that her life involved such harsh dilemmas. Pedro lost his way, Julia continued. Now with tears she was struggling to hold back, and I lost him to a world that swallows our dreams. He got involved with people I would never have chosen for him, but I had no way to save him. While I spent nights here, serving and cleaning, he was becoming a stranger, distant and bitter. Ricardo, now visibly shaken, looked at Julia with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Guilt. She held back her tears but continued, determined to make herself heard that night. Ricardo felt a tightness in his chest. He was beginning to understand that her story was, in part, his as well. "I'm here, Mr. Bellini," Julia concluded, "because even after everything, I couldn't give up. But I never expected you to understand the extent of the sacrifices I've made. To everyone here, I'm just a maid. But to my son, I was everything he had. And I failed him." With those words, Julia let silence fill the room, and what had once been mere curiosity transformed into a mix of empathy and respect. These people were no longer looking at just a maid. They were standing before a mother who fought, someone who, in quiet resilience, carried a world of sacrifices no one could ever fully understand. The silence that followed Julia's words had transformed the restaurant from a place of business into a space for reflection. The executives, so accustomed to seeing themselves as conquerors of the world, now faced a common woman who had just exposed the depths of a pain they, in their comfortable reality, had never experienced. Ricardo, standing beside her, didn't know how to react. Part of him wanted to interrupt, but another part felt that there was something too essential, too true in Julia's words to be silenced. Suddenly, a deep, raspy voice broke the silence. It was Enrique Brandeo, one of Ricardo's oldest friends and business partners. "But what about you, Ricardo? Don't you think you should have known more about her life, especially after all these years?" The question wasn't just a provocation. It held a veiled criticism that struck Ricardo like a blow. Ricardo, visibly unsettled, took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure. "I've always treated her well, Enrique. I paid her fairly, provided her a decent place to live, and I respected her. Isn't that enough?" He looked at Julia, hoping she would agree with him, searching for some form of absolution in her expression. But Julia remained silent, which spoke more than any words could. Enrique raised an eyebrow, a cynical smile playing on his face. Sometimes money isn't everything, Ricardo. Sometimes people need more than a paycheck. They need to be recognized, to be seen as more than what they do. Ricardo felt the weight of both Enrique's and Julia's words pressing down on his heart. It wasn't just about not seeing Julia's reality. It was also about ignoring an entire life unfolding right in front of him, without ever questioning if her loyalty bore a burden he'd never noticed. Before he could respond, Julia spoke again, her voice now calm and controlled, but with a seriousness that left no room for interruption. "Mr. Bellini," she said, looking at him directly, "you always believed that by giving me a place to work, you were doing your part. But maybe you never understood that I am a person, with dreams, pains, and fears that extend beyond your house. I spent years dedicating myself to your family, and perhaps I lost my own in the process." Ricardo looked away, feeling a guilt he didn't know how to handle. Julia had spoken the raw truth, and he realized he had never thought of her as anything beyond a loyal employee. The tone in her voice wasn't resentful, but one of resigned bitterness, like someone who had accepted her imposed conditions, but who had now decided that her story deserved to be told. Then she revealed something even deeper. "I never mentioned this before, but when Pedro was younger, he was involved in an accident. It was a terrible time, and I had to choose between paying his medical bills or continuing to work at your house, Mr. Bellini. I couldn't ask for help. I had no one to turn to, and in the end, he never fully recovered from it." Ricardo listened to every word with a tightening heart. He tried to recall if Julia had ever shown signs of needing help, but he couldn't remember anything. In his mind, everything had always seemed fine. He had never considered that she might be facing such a large burden, keeping it all to herself. One of the younger executives at the table, Marcos, who had been silent until then, commented, "It's so easy to overlook other people's sacrifices, isn't it? We go through our lives without really caring about those around us. And sometimes, we forget that these sacrifices are made by people like her, who have their own stories, their own loves, and their own tragedies." Marcos's words echoed among those present, and some lowered their heads, embarrassed. Ricardo's expression was one of discomfort, for he knew that, at some point, he had neglected all this, focusing solely on his own business and ambitions. He had always trusted Julia, but he had never thought to trust her as someone with a voice and a story. Julia, meanwhile, remained calm, though her eyes revealed emotions long repressed. "I didn't come here to accuse anyone, Mr. Bellini. I came because, after so many years, I realized that I need to tell my story. I devoted most of my life to serving your household. But I lost my son to a world I barely understood, and that's something I'll never get back." Ricardo felt the weight of her every word and, for the first time, recognized the gravity of his omissions. He realized that Julia was not merely an invisible part of his life. She was someone he had failed to truly see. The silence was heavy, and Julia's words had touched everyone there, pulling each of them out of their comfortable indifference. They were no longer witnessing a mere revelation. They were experiencing a catharsis, a confession from someone who had borne her own burdens in silence, but had finally chosen to be seen. After Julia's words, a heavy silence settled over the table. Ricardo's breathing was short and tense, as if each word from her echoed in his mind, each detail reshaping the way he saw his own life and the years he had shared with her. His sense of being a good employer, a certainty of his own benevolence, crumbled under each silent sacrifice Julia revealed. Enrique, still with a serious expression, turned to Ricardo and asked a question everyone else was thinking but no one dared to voice. "And now, Ricardo, what are you going to do with all this?" The question made Ricardo startle. He didn't know. He had never been in such an uncomfortable position, never confronted so directly with a responsibility he'd preferred to ignore. I didn't know she was going through all this. Julia never told me," he stammered, trying to justify his own disinterest over the years. But deep down, he knew that even if she had tried to speak, he wouldn't have listened. He was always too busy, too comfortable in his own bubble, to notice anything beyond his business. At that moment, Julia looked at him with a tired but calm gaze and said, "Mr. Bellini, I never expected you to know. The things I went through weren't part of your world." She paused, as if deciding whether to continue. "But it's not too late to start understanding." Her words carried a fragile but genuine hope. For the first time, Ricardo felt that maybe he had a chance to mend what he had never cared enough to see. But he also knew that gestures made too late wouldn't change the past, and Julia had suffered an irreparable loss. In his pursuit of success, he had overlooked everything and everyone, blind to anything outside his bubble of power and luxury. Enrique leaned slightly toward Julia and said, with a sincerity that seemed new even to him, "You're absolutely right, Julia. We, who chase power and fortune, forget that all of it rests on people like you. There's no excuse for our indifference." Other businesspeople around the table, who had spent the evening comparing their fortunes and sharing stories of success, also began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. One of the executives, Eduardo, visibly moved, commented, "I've never thought about it this way. Maybe we should learn to listen more, to notice those who support everything we achieve." Ricardo then surprised everyone by standing up and, with a serious look, addressing Julia, "Julia, I've been a fool all these years. I thought I was fulfilling my role as a good employer, but I was blind to everything you went through. I'd like to do something to make amends, to help you and, if possible, honor Pedro's memory." Julia, who had maintained a firm posture throughout the evening, seemed to weaken for a brief moment. Her expression revealed an internal struggle between pride and the need for a helping hand. She hesitated but finally replied, with a resigned tone, "I appreciate your intention, Mr. Bellini. But Pedro, he's gone, and nothing can bring him back." Everyone around the table felt the weight of those words. What was at stake here wasn't merely a financial issue. It was the pain of a mother who had lost her son to the streets, to a world of dangers and vices that she'd never been able to fight alone. Only Enrique dared to speak, breaking the tension of the moment. "Maybe it's too late to change the past, Ricardo, but it's not too late for you to learn from it." His words were a mixture of encouragement and reproach, and Ricardo realized his friend was trying to offer him a new perspective. That night, the business dinner had transformed into a lesson in humility, in humanity. The business people there, so used to controlling what they wanted, were faced with something that no amount of money could change. They felt challenged by Julia's vulnerability, and a deep discomfort stirred within them all. After a few moments of reflection, Ricardo looked at Julia and spoke more softly, something rare in his voice. "I can't bring Pedro back, but I can honor his memory. And from today, I'll try to do something to make up, even if only slightly, for years of disregard. I promise to help you in every way I can." Julia nodded, still restrained. She knew promises were easy words, hard to fulfill. But for a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope. After all, that night she had truly been heard. Around her, the other business people exchanged thoughtful glances. Enrique smiled slightly and looked at Ricardo, with the weary look of a man who, in that moment, was also rethinking his own life. "Maybe all of us could start doing something to change the way we treat the people around us," he said, his voice low but filled with meaning. Thus, the dinner that had started with cold, self-serving intentions ended with something far deeper. Julia, as she stood up, felt a slight tremor in her heart. Perhaps, for the first time in many years, she was no longer invisible. At the end of the dinner, Ricardo invited Julia for a private conversation in his meeting room, located in the same building as his main office. Julia hesitated for a moment but accepted, hoping that this night would signify real change. When they arrived, Ricardo closed the door, gesturing for her to sit in an opulent leather chair that contrasted sharply with her simple presence. He began to speak, this time with a sincerity she had never heard before. "Julia, I've thought a lot about everything you said tonight. For all these years, I saw you as part of my everyday life, but I never really saw you. I can't change that, but I want to learn from my mistakes. And from today, I want you to feel truly recognized." Julia looked at him, surprised, but maintained her calm expression. "Mr. Bellini, recognition is important, yes. But all I've ever wanted was to be treated with respect and dignity. Nothing can erase what I've lost, but maybe your understanding can prevent others from going through the same." Ricardo nodded, feeling disarmed. For the first time, he realized that the power and fortune he valued so much meant nothing in the face of something so simple and yet so essential. Julia's frankness made him see that he had failed at something far greater than his business. He had failed as a human being. "I promise, Julia. I'll do that," he affirmed, with a determination that gave his words a depth greater than any contract he had ever signed. However, to Ricardo's surprise, Julia began to speak about something he hadn't expected. "Mr. Bellini, there's something else I would like to ask. You have enormous influence and know people in high places. I'd like to propose a project in memory of my son and all those who, like him, never had the chance for a decent life." Ricardo was intrigued but interested. "What do you have in mind, Julia?" He knew this woman held invaluable wisdom, and he was determined to listen, however unusual it seemed. "I would like you to help found an organization to support mothers who, like me, struggle alone to raise their children. A place where they can seek guidance and resources, where their voices can be heard. I want Pedro to be remembered for something positive. I want his story to inspire change, and for his suffering to help other children escape a similar fate." Ricardo was struck by the strength of her request. He knew the project would require time, investment, and effort. But as he looked at Julia and saw the intensity in her eyes, he understood that this was more than a simple request. It was a plea from a mother seeking justice on behalf of those who suffered in silence. "I'll do it, Julia," he replied, with a determination that left no room for doubt. "It will be called the Pedro Bellini Foundation, and it will help all the families facing the same struggles you faced." His words carried a sincerity Julia immediately recognized, and for the first time, a gentle smile brightened her face. She knew this was the beginning of a journey bigger than herself. Months after that dinner, the Pedro Bellini Foundation was inaugurated with a simple yet moving ceremony. Julia attended, seeing her son's name shine on a marble plaque, feeling that, in some way, her pain had transformed into hope for others. Ricardo spoke at the ceremony about the importance of seeing beyond appearances, of recognizing the humanity in people, regardless of social status. For him, creating the foundation marked a turning point in his life. Over the following months, he dedicated time to hearing the stories of those who worked for him, something he had never done before. He discovered details and life stories that inspired him to reform his companies, implementing more inclusive and respectful policies, and to view every person who crossed his path as a complete human being. As for Julia, who chose to continue working for the Bellini family, she had become a respected and admired presence. Her example and her fight resonated with all the employees, and she was now seen not just as a dedicated housekeeper, but as the woman who inspired one of the most powerful men in the country to recognize the human worth in every life. At the end of that first event, Ricardo approached Julia, his voice filled with emotion, and said, "I'll never be able to repair the past, Julia, but I hope Pedro is proud of you. Your strength and your story changed my life, and through this foundation, he will live on forever." Julia smiled, now with tears in her eyes. She knew she could never bring Pedro back, but she felt his spirit was still there, now as a beacon for other mothers and children. From that day forward, many lives would begin to change, and Julia's once silent, invisible sacrifice would echo through generations. Years had passed since that unforgettable night, and the Pedro Bellini Foundation had grown into a strong and respected organization. The foundation expanded every day, with branches in multiple cities and a support network assisting thousands of vulnerable mothers and children. Julia's vision had undeniably made an impact, and Pedro's legacy transformed into something powerful and enduring, keeping his memory alive in a way she had never imagined possible. Julia, now with a renewed spark in her eyes, continued her work but had taken on a more significant role in coordinating the foundation, advising and helping other women overcome obstacles similar to those she had faced. She became a mentor to many mothers searching for a new chance, a quiet strength helping to rebuild lives through her example of courage and resilience. Ricardo, changed by the experience, was a different man. His businesses thrived, but now he invested part of his fortune in social causes, and his relationships with his employees became closer and more genuine. He made it a point to know the stories of those working alongside him, realizing that success and power only made sense when shared. The coldness that once dominated his perspective had given way to an empathy he hadn't known before. One sunny afternoon, he and Julia met at a foundation ceremony. Ricardo, older and with a calm demeanor, thanked her for being there and asked her to speak to the audience, a gathering of mothers and families supported by the organization. Julia, humbly, took the stage, and as she looked out over the crowd, she remembered everything she had been through, the sacrifices and pain that had led to this transformation. Pedro's story isn't just mine, and the Pedro Bellini Foundation isn't just about him or me, she began, her voice clear and resonant. It's about each of you here today. It's about our ability to endure and transform pain into strength. It's about the power each of us has to change the future for our children and the generations to come. My son isn't with me anymore, but through all of you he lives. And that's something no one can ever take away. Julia's words echoed through the crowd, who were moved and applauded with fervor. Among them were mothers and children who had once suffered the same hardships as she had, now looking to her as a symbol of resilience and hope. It marked the end of a long journey of silent suffering, but also the beginning of a story of transformation that inspired everyone around her. At the end of the ceremony, Ricardo approached Julia and, without a word, offered her a silent hug. Both knew this moment was a symbolic farewell to who they once were. Julia, who had always been the invisible woman in the background of Ricardo's life, was now a guiding light for others in their struggle. And he, once the unfeeling businessman, had found in her a way to redefine his own legacy. That night, as they left the ceremony together, Ricardo thanked her once more. Julia, you've taught me more than any financial success ever could. You changed my life and the lives of so many others. I can never truly express how grateful I am to you. She smiled peacefully, like someone who had finally found solace. It wasn't just for you, Mr. Bellini. It was for all the invisible people, for all the silenced voices. You simply gave me a chance to be heard. And with that, you gave voice to many. That night marked a profound transformation. They both moved forward, but the connection they had built would remain forever. A constant reminder that even the most unlikely relationships can change lives. Ricardo and Julia left the ceremony in silence, but with the certainty that, despite the pain of the past, they had created something that would last forever.